Hi, my name is Bee. This is the third part of me going over all of the plushes I have designed before starting this channel. Today, I'm going to go over my biggest project to date, which is what I did this summer after my junior year of college. I wanted to do something where I could hone my skills, practice a bunch, and get a lot of pieces for my portfolio. In hindsight, this wasn't the best project because it is based on IP that I don't own. It's characters that I didn't design, but let's give it a look. To start, these are all based off the egg characters of the first QSMP. So in 2023, a streamer named Quackity was starting this server, and I was like, I heard great things about how his production level in lore, and I was excited to see what this server could hold. So I started watching the streams, and these egg characters were introduced, and I was hooked. The character design is so well done, and the admins who played them, they had a way to just hook your attention, and it was amazing. I wanted to show my appreciation by recreating these characters that I loved in plush form, because I knew that in the fandom I hadn't seen much of it. There are definitely some people who were crocheting egg plushes, but I'm one of the few people who can pattern it out in sewing terms, so that's what I wanted to do. So I started by patterning out the eggs. And these models were not released to the public. So for me, I went and I got as many reference photos as I could, and I assembled them all on my computer, and then I pulled up Procreate and set the DPI as low as possible. It was one of the most time-consuming things I have ever drawn, but I did turnaround shots of each and every egg, at least for the first batch. So you can see all the eggs got their own turnarounds. The eggs with more complicated accessories, I did add additional side profiles to, like Lula, Bobby, Dapper, Trumpet, Leo, especially Cheyenne, because I just needed more information, and that helped me plan the accessories a little more. You can also see that for Leo, I did originally think I was going to make the mushroom hat for them, but again, I ran out of time. Also, making these many eggs and accessories, it caused a little bit of burnout. You can also see all my math at the bottom of the page. Mainly, I was comparing the pixel sizes to the size of a block in Minecraft, because in Minecraft, a block is known to be 1 meter long each way because it's a cube. So that's what I was using for comparison's sake. They don't match up all the way, and meter is not what I used for measurements. That would be way too big for the eggs, but it did help me get a ratio of how I wanted the egg compared to the legs and how I wanted the side width compared to the height. It just helped me see about the general shapes with more standard numbers. So after I did the turnarounds, then I went into making all of my drafts of the egg. There is a way that I could have made the pattern from the numbers just converted to whatever size I want using those ratios, but that's not what I ended up doing. I ended up doing the size of height measurement for the height of the body pattern. You can see one of my drafts for the egg pattern. It was really simple to get the diameter for the width, but the height was a little bit more difficult because I knew about the height. I didn't want to do all of the math to get what the actual diameter would be at that height of the egg. There is definitely a way to do it with ratios, but at this point I had been an art student for 3 years, so I was really not looking to do any more complicated math than ratios and just sketching things out. So that's what I did, and I just used that as a base point to jump off from, to then modify and really fine-tune it to be what I wanted it to look like. But it did help a lot with the legs. The legs were a lot more standardized, and I could make them a lot more exact to the ratio. So when we look at my first 3 muslin models of the egg, we can see the side effects of using the height of the original egg as I wanted it as the standard height of the pattern instead of the diameter of the vertical circle of the egg. You can see that the first 2 muslin patterns are very circular and they're very short. The horizontal diameter is what I wanted it to be, but the vertical is just not there. I really had to increase the size of that vertical length of the pattern piece to get it where I wanted it to go, and I had to play around with where the pattern piece curve would fall to make sure that it would curve at the lower end of the egg and make it sort of asymmetrical still. So after working on the pattern and doing the models out of muslin, I was able to do a copy out of the final material that I was going to use. And the egg came out pretty well, but I really wanted to test to see if I wanted the 3D legs or the 2D legs. So that is the second thing. I was using my colored copy to test for 2D or 3D legs. I can also include a picture. I did put my glasses, which are very similar to the ones Juana Flipa has. I put mine on the egg just to see what it would look like and be like, oh my gosh, I have an egg, so I could show all my friends in the fandom. And then looking at the colored model, I thought that the 2D legs had character to them, but they didn't really scream plush, and they were not true to the character. The legs have a width, like they are a pixel thick, so I did want to make sure I showed that in the patterns I made. As for the leg pattern, I really don't remember what I did to get the pattern idea. I know it's cylinders for most of it, and I knew it would be a circle to cap it off, but the angle that I got at the heel, I really don't remember how that happened. I think I referenced other pre-existing patterns on the market to see what would make an angle like that, and then I just fine-tuned it or used like the same angle so I knew it would fit. But the leg did turn out pretty good. I just needed to decrease the foot size compared to the leg size. So after making that decision and after being happy about how the egg body looked in the color model, I was happy to move on and cut and make every single one of the eggs before I started the accessories. I made every single one, even Geg. They all got made before I even started the accessories. Now, let's talk about the things that did not go so well when making all of the egg bases. For starters, the fabric was stretchy, so that means that when I was sewing it, it showed a lot of mistakes, and it didn't always show exactly the form I wanted it to show, which means that I had to do something to kind of bring the eggs back into the shape that I knew the pattern had. So to do that, you wash the eggs on delicate, and then you throw them in the dryer, and when they come out, the fabric is a little more used to where the seams are, where the cuts of the fabric are, and the stuffing will help just bring its true shape to light. So that's something that I did. And then there's the feet. When I was sewing the feet, I did not have markers on the egg base to show me where I needed the legs to be, and it was kind of guess and check for aligning the legs to where they should be, which was a little bit difficult, but I had so many eggs that the variation that showed through was kind of cool, but also you really have to be very specific. I ended up using a seam ripper to redo quite a few of the legs. It took me 5 eggs to figure out the best orientation for the feet. You really have to point them more inwards and sideways when they're on the fabric for them to be straight up and down on the final form. And also with that, one of the things that I learned through my mushroom was pre-sewing one side of the limb, in this case the leg, onto one side of the fabric. So I would pre-sew both legs onto one side of the fabric, and then I would do the final seam in between the 2 pieces of fabric with the legs, and I would go 2 pieces of fabric, not do the full leg seam, and only do one of the halves, if that makes any sense, to connect them but still have the legs be free. So now let's talk about the accessories. You can definitely tell who my favorite eggs are. I did not stick with a random order. I did it based on 1, which accessories I wanted to do first, and 2, which eggs were my favorite. Talene was the very first, but that is only because a ribbon is the easiest accessory to make. Do I feel bad that Talene died in early death? Yes. But she didn't have that much personality yet. It was still very early in the server when she passed away, so she was mostly made first just because of the ribbon. So as I said, a ribbon is very easy. That's why I started with Taline's accessory first. All I had to do was really cut a ribbon, seal it, that's why I have a lighter, and then just stick it on the egg, right? Well, it is an accessory for an egg, and I was really excited about this project, so I did want to give it my best effort, so I wanted to make the ribbon stand out. How do you do that? You use wire. So I did end up doing 2 attempts of the ribbon. One, I just sewed a ribbon as normal, put a little bit of an extra ribbon around it just to give it that extra look, and then I tried putting a wire on the inside of the bow, but it didn't stay the best and it didn't look the best, so I decided against that. And as you can see, I ended up doing a double ribbon, so I sewed 2 ribbon together and put a wire inside. It didn't hold up the best because I ended up doing 1 wire for one side of the ribbon and a different wire for the other side of the ribbon, and that meant there was a lack of stability in the middle of the ribbon where most of the connection and most of the weight was connected to the egg, so it just didn't stand up the best. I should have done 1 wire that goes from the left to the right instead of 1 for each side. Something I should say is I did bend the ends of my wire to make it safe so I wouldn't get poked by it, and I did also add a button onto the middle part of the ribbon so it can attach very nicely onto the egg. Yes, that is how you make the trash bag ribbon of Taline. No sewing pattern necessary. But Riches and Palm, the lore connected to those eggs is some of the most fantastic examples of what the server had to offer. It was so amazing. So, Riches and Palm, they were 2 of the first eggs that I made. So between the 2 of Palm and Riches, I did decide to start with Riches. This is mostly because I had a better grasp of what his apparel would be like. I've previously designed fashion apparel and I have experience sewing it, so it's something I'm more confident with than sewing hats, so that's why I chose to go with Riches first. And also, he was there before Palm, so I did have more time to get attached to him, so that definitely helped. Here you can see me doing the proper way to make a pattern. I'm measuring out on the physical egg that I'm going to be using with a measuring tape, so I get the best measurements possible and it's exact to the egg that I'm using. It's not just a random egg that I may use or may not use. For all the eggs, I decide on which egg before I start making the accessory. Later in the process, you will see that I get a little bit lazy and I stop doing all the work with the measuring tape and I'm not as clean with it. This comes to bite me in the butt on some of them, but for at least the first one with Riches, I do it properly. So take note from this one. If you're going to take anything away, this is the proper way. Also, I would love for you to take your attention to the bottom right corner of the page. Before I start sketching any actual pattern pieces, I do a quick sketch of the pattern pieces that I know I'm going to need. For this, I know I'm going to need the main piece of the shirt and the sleeve. So those are the 2 main pieces I'll be focusing on. And then after I go and I add binding and trim to add that color because that's part of Riches' model. This is also where I go in and I write down all my measurements so I know exactly what I'm measuring and what it's going to mean in the pattern piece. From there, I then have the information I need to start working on the larger sketch. First, I plot the points based on the measurements I have so I know where I'm going to be drawing, and then I start sketching in some lines. It doesn't matter that the curve is perfect, but I'm just lining them up to where the measurement would be where I have the tape measure, right? So the neckline, I measure about on the egg where I want the shoulders to be and the difference in measurement between where I want the shoulders to start and where I want the neckline to be, and that's how I know my measurement for the neckline neckline. I will go and clean these sketches up in Adobe Illustrator. I don't use that anymore. You can use Inkscape. It works just as well for pattern design, but these are not my final sketches. These are just my drafts, and I'm going in and I'm just ghosting the curves because they don't have to be perfect at this moment. For the shoulder seam, it does seem tricky and it may look confusing if this is your first time seeing a sleeve ending with the bell curve, but basically the bell curve height is how big you want the shoulder to be, and because Richus and all of the eggs don't have arms or hands, I can choose whatever height I want for this, so it's going to be quite a shallow bell curve, just so it can be a little bit floppier. I try to make it even so the sleeve falls flat to the ground about where the jersey ends. Really, the most important thing to consider with the armholes and sleeves for the shirt is that the curve that connects the arm to the sleeve needs to be physically the same length as the curve on the main part of the shirt, because they need to be able to match up. This is of course with seam lengths in mind, so the sleeve and the shirt are both going to have seam lengths around the side of the shirt, at least for this jersey. So if you are changing the shirt to not have a seam at the side, you need to reflect that in the length of the line of the bell curve. So keep that in mind. And those are the most important curves that actually do need to be measured. The neckline itself and the neckline in the back of the shirt can really be however you want, as long as it's not too loose that the shirt will fall off. And that's all you have to keep in mind. It's very simple. I really should have gone and referenced an actual football jersey of Brazil, because that is what the model was referenced on, but I wanted to reference all my patterns on just the 3D model to keep it as close to canon as I could. I also want to say I did not make it perfect because I did not keep all of the jersey numbers and stuff. That later models, it became clearer what it was that was written on the jersey, but in early models it looked to me kind of like a monster face, so I really simplified it down a lot and I just went with a square where the numbers could be. You can very easily go and change the square into the numbers you want it to be and add the little logo on the chest side, or the tiny little details if you want. They wouldn't be that difficult to embroider on, or as I like doing, you can needle felt them on, or you could simply cut them out of felt and just sew them on top or applique them. There's a lot of different ways that can get the details on. It's just not what I was doing. I wanted to keep the pattern very simple, and even though it is canon to the character, I wanted to keep the piece count very low, and with the trims, the piece count for Richus was getting pretty high. So I wanted to go with the most important detail, which was the large square, aka the numbers, and the other ones are just up for interpretation for whoever makes them. Here you can see me start to sew and then finish sewing the first muslin copy of Richarlison's shirt. The first draft was not perfect by any means. It looked pretty cute, but as you can see, it's literally falling off the egg, so I did need to reduce the size of the main part of the shirt. The arms are pretty decent, but they aren't falling the way I want them to, so I am going to fool around with the bell curve, and mainly it'll be on the side of the main shirt, just increasing the size of the armhole to make it a little bit droopier and make it feel a little bit more oversized. So I go and I make those changes online because I know what I need to do, and then you can see me just jump right into the final copy. It's pretty sporadic what things I videoed and what things I did not video, especially since I was taking these on my phone and my phone video space was not the best, and it has been a few years, so some videos have gotten lost over time, so you'll get to see different parts of the process for all of the different egg accessories. But Richus, you can see me going in and adding the trims to the hem, you can see me adding the shirt, you can see the bright colors, they definitely scream Brazil. With that being said, I did include in my pattern main fabric, accent fabric 2 instead of the colors, because I wanted to give people the freedom to choose their own colors and create what they see fit with my patterns. I made these patterns knowing I would share them with the community so they could get remade and retouched and altered and everything. I think fan art inspires fan art inspires art. Building off of each other is what community is all about. I love seeing inspiration from pieces. Like, I was inspired by fan art for this. Riches has so much fan art of him in an oversized jersey, and even if the 3D model it's only a little bit, I really went big with it for the sleeves because it's something that inspired me in fan art. And I know I talked a lot about sticking with model, but I think something beautiful comes when you get inspired by each other, especially people who are also artists. Art should inspire art. And yeah, it came out really cute. It's not a terribly difficult pattern, and the lower hem and the hem at the end of the sleeves, I didn't really pay too much mind to. I just made trim, which was a rectangle, the size of the line that would be, and that was what I did for those pattern pieces. And because it's a shirt, I don't need to hide any seams, unlike a plush pattern where you really want to hide all your seams. Clothing, it's kind of known that you'll see seams inside the pieces of clothing. And I would also like to show you that one of the decisions I made while making all the eggs that I did not say during the egg making montage is that I purposefully thought ahead and I made one egg with one leg that was shorter than the others, because that is canon to Richus's character. One of his legs in game is corrupted, and as a result it's shorter than the rest of the egg's legs. So I wanted to show that in my plush creation. So that's something you can do. I just moved the leg further up, making the leg part just shorter. So that's my Richus. So, as I said, Palm was the other one of my favorite eggs, so she was the third egg that I made. So I started very similar to Richarlison in that I was marking measurements, drawing the pieces that I need, and sketching it on paper first. You can see I start with the cheek accessories. I'm just doing 1/2 because I can double it to get it even, and then I am going and I am drawing the circle for her beret, and then I'm adding seam allowance. I decided to do needle felting for the cheek accessories, even though it is less accessible, because there are ways you can do it. You can sew the cheek accessories on, but it was the way that I could do that. I could get it without visible seams, still look good, and something that I enjoy. And you can see I did not reference an actual beret pattern for this. I wanted to see if I could do it a different way, because an actual beret pattern uses a lot of fabric. You have to cut out a circle with seam allowance, and then you have to cut out another circle with a hole in it. That's the proper way to make a beret, but I wanted to see other ways to do it to see if I could save on fabric. So that's what you're going to see me try out. I'm trying to see if I can do it with just a binding, another little rectangle going down below the beret, and as you'll see, it does not turn out very good. I will also say for Palm, even though it isn't included, I did go around and I measured the circumference of the top part of her egg that I chose for her. So the measurements for the pattern pieces I'm using now, they didn't just come out of nowhere. I did measure the egg that I used, as I said previously with Richus. At least this far in the beginning, I was definitely on top of making sure my measurements fit the actual eggs I was using. But here you can see me sewing it. I definitely should have gone and pinned it first for a more close fit, but it's a muslin copy, so it'll still show what needs to be worked on no matter. And the thing is, it came out much more cylindrical than I really wanted. Like, you can see that it still looks pretty much like a beret, but I wanted it to be a beret, not just look close enough, which is why I went with an actual beret type pattern, just scaled down. This was my second attempt. I thought that if I made the closure more angled at the end, then you could have the decrease from where the seam would be to where it connected with Pom's egg, and that just did not work out at all. Yeah, you can see that I'm getting frustrated. Like, it still works enough. I just wanted it to be the best it could be, but I still wanted to be the one actually designing the pattern, which is why relying on a pattern that was already made felt like it was defeating the purpose of why I chose to do this project over the summer. Because at this state, I still had a lot of energy, and this is an egg that I have a lot of love for and a lot of favoritism towards, so I wanted her to be the best she could be. So this is me using what an actual beret pattern would be, which does waste fabric. And also, I do want to bring it to your attention that I did not hem the raw edge of the beret. With normal fabrics, you would want to hem it, but since I used felt, felt does not fray, so I did not need to add a hem to the raw edge. It will just stay as it is. It will warp a little bit over time, especially if it's being stretched, but since I measured the circumference of her head, she should be alright, and it should stay relatively the same. And again, it's harder to tell with felt, but I am sewing wrong sides together, which means I am going to flip this right side out so that the seam is a little more hidden. And just look at how nice and flat that is. That is much more of a beret than my prototypes beforehand. And then I'm putting the little tag on. I also included a pattern piece that if you wanted to create an apple beret, you definitely could. I included a little leaf tag that you could add on. I wanted to keep it close to canon, but those pieces of fan art definitely stuck in my heart, so I wanted to make sure I gave that an option. And you can see it in this. It's just a little teardrop. If you cut it in green and maybe sewed an extra seam on top to give it some texture, it would look really nice as a palm leaf. And then it's felt, so it just got needle felted on very easily. And if you don't know how to needle felt, I highly recommend it. It's very fun. I think if you learn one fiber arts, it's definitely worth learning at least a few parts of other fiber arts because they mesh together very well. She's so cute. And there is her finished copy. She looks very close to canon, and I love her a lot. I think it's really easy when the pieces are something that has historically been patterned out a lot, and it's very easy to find online how to make a beret. And then the cheeks were just up for interpretation. And then after those three, Bobby was the fourth, and that was a tough one. Bobby the egg died actually, I think it was the day before or the day that I got the fabric for this project. So I knew I wanted to make him early, even though his pattern is so complicated. One of the egg parents to him is Jaden Animations, who I love her videos and I loved watching her explore Minecraft in this weird, wacky server. So I was just very attached to her lore and the egg that she had. So he was made very early on. You'll see I start very similarly to how I started with riches because they are both clothing items. I am going to start by making a small little sketch in the corner and planning out the pattern pieces that I am going to need and I am going to measure for. Mainly for Bobby's overalls, it's going to be pant legs that are long enough that I can fold up, and it's going to be the overall front and back, and pocket and straps. And you'll see, unlike with riches, I did not use my tape measure on the egg, and I did not use my T-square on the paper. So the measurements were not good. You can see me literally tracing the leg, trying to flatten it, and that is just not how you should measure for pattern pieces. So this is definitely where I started to lose steam in my pattern making egg journey. I guess after so many eggs, you really lose your ability to have patience and do things properly. Now we're going to skip ahead a bit, and you can see that I've already gone ahead and I have edited the rough pattern pieces that I cut out of paper. I've scanned them, put them into Adobe again, made the lines straighter, measured some of the curves, but I have not measured them properly, so is going to need refining after the fact. Though props, I am cutting the fabric properly. When you cut fabric, you want to keep the bottom of your scissors on your cutting surface and just snip away. That is how you should be cutting fabric. You cut fur fabric differently, but let's stick with like flat fabric for now. So this would be the pant leg. So I need to give this one a hem because it's going to be made out of a cotton fabric, and the muslin itself acts very similarly to cotton, so it's worth practicing the hem. Okay, so you can see that I am sewing the legs onto the overalls. I basted them onto the overalls first, which means that I turned the length of my stitch up all the way. So I believe it goes to like 5 millimeters or something for basting. And then you sew in the seam allowance. So in the seam allowance means that my seam allowance, I usually have it marked for 1/4 of an inch because it lets me use my quartering foot when I sew. Normally in clothes, you do 3/8 of an inch, which is a little more than 1/4, but that's for human proportions. For sewing stuffed animals and plushes, it's usually about 1/4 of an inch again, just to keep the seam allowances small so you're not like bulking them up too much. But back to basting. Basically, sewing in the seam allowance means I'm doing a smaller seam allowance for the basting. So instead of 1/4 of an inch, I would put the basting seam at 1/8 of an inch. So it's smaller, so it will be in the seam allowance. I can remove the basting stitches really easily and it will free the fabric of the legs back up. It's just to keep them onto the fabric while I sew the pieces together. And it works really well. Basting stitches are one of the most useful stitches you have access to. And you can see that the pant legs were a bit too small because I was really struggling to get them on the egg model. And then, yeah, the overalls themselves were just way too tight on the egg because I didn't measure with the tape measure and I just tried to squish it down. There's no way to account for all of the volume when you squish something down to measure it. So you are losing surface area that just isn't squished down enough. So it's going to make things more tight, like a tighter fit. So I went back in with Adobe Illustrator and I made the necessary changes to the pattern based on what I saw in the muslin model. I am making another muslin copy so I can see if it fits again before using my nice fabric. I am doing that first. And for this, I really increased the bottom of the egg. So I increased the curve. Yeah, you can see that the egg is like puffing out over the overalls, which shows how tight it is. And then I'm marking where the pant legs are going to go. And then I think the overall straps kept the same length or I increased them slightly. I want to keep the overall straps pretty small because when I was fabric shopping, I got actual attachments for the overalls to make them look like snaps, and I want to keep the overall straps about the same size as the snaps that I got. Yeah, and the second time sewing the muslin copy will go much easier because I know the order which I'm going to do them. And I can just see the new strap on Bobby as I'm going. And I think I lost footage because I'm just jumping to the next one. And I did have to decrease the size of the curve slightly, and I did not end up making a third muslin model. You can see Bobby in the muslin copy on the side. It does get pretty loose towards the bottom of the curve, and that is something that is in my final copy as well. It's much baggier at the bottom of the egg, and I did not fix that. And that is why we measure properly before we start making a pattern. Yeah, it's about 3 millimeters bigger than it needs to be. And also, you could use actual denim for this. I'm using cotton because I really want my egg plushes to like be comfortable and soft like plushes are. But I am losing the authenticity of making it actual overalls due to this. But I do think that the navy cotton does a very good job replicating the colors, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to use white for my thread color, which will give it more of an appearance of denim. Also, hack for when you are turning things inside out. You'll see that sometimes I use a pair of forceps, which is what my sewing teacher in college gave me to turn stuff right side out, but sometimes that's not going to always work. Sometimes the easiest way to turn something inside out is to put a safety pin on the end and you push the safety pin through. This is also a really good way to thread the strings of hoodies back through your hoodie. You can do that, and that's really useful. Now we are sewing the leg part of the pants, and I will say there is some visible stitching because the hem is rolled over because they're overalls and that's sort of the look they have. So I will say for the pant legs that they are rectangles for Bobby because the physical legs of the eggs are made from rectangles. So if they were legs like people legs, they would have shapes to it. But because the egg legs are very straight cylinders made from rectangles, that's why the pant legs are also made from rectangles. Do not try to make pants for people this way. It will not look good. And also I forgot to mention that the pocket actually works, so it's not perfectly sewn on. I'm going and I'm taking my time to sew the pocket on top of the overalls, which really should be top stitched. It was very difficult to angle the pocket in a way I can sew, and this actually warped the overalls a little bit, trying to hide the seam. I really should have ironed the seam allowance down first and then top stitched the pocket on. That's how I should have done this properly. But instead, I guessed where the pocket would be and I warped my fabric. Don't be like Bixie. Do it properly. Yeah, you can see just how many wrinkles I'm getting in the pocket by doing this. I love looking back at how I messed things up and seeing exactly what went wrong. Like in the moment of making this, I truly thought it would be okay and it is fine, but just looking at it through the lens of the camera and seeing how much it warped really changes my perspective on this pattern. Because, yeah, now I look at the finished Bobby and I'm like, you know what? He looks pretty cute, but when you can see all the errors this close, it really gives you frame of reference. And there you can see me with my seam ripper. I think that was either taking a basting stitch out or undoing something on the pocket. Also, for those new sewists in the audience, when you are using the seam ripper, you should use the pointed part to pick one stitch out, a singular stitch, and then you turn the seam ripper so that the pinhead side is underneath the stitches, and that is how you have a nice clean cut of stitches. It is very specifically made to fit in between stitches and to not poke through the fabric if you use it properly. Oh, wait, I know what I'm doing with the legs. Okay, so I'm doing something similar to what I did to sew the egg legs on, where I'm sewing down half of the legs onto one half of the overalls, so it's easier for me to go in and sew the other half of the legs onto the other half of the overalls when I go and do the joining stitch, which sounds confusing. It's easier when you can see it, but I'm kind of folding the seams back as I sew over them here. You can see that I have them pinned. It's something that I'm doing to make sure that the legs have an opening in between them, right? So if I sewed the middle seam from side to side straight through, it would close the legs off. So I need to make sure that I'm getting both the front and back seam of the pant leg. So it just takes more seams. And normally in pants, you would go from the side of the pant down to the bottom of one side of the leg. So from the middle of the pant leg through to the middle of the other pant leg, and then sew the other side. But because this is smaller proportions, I'm just using a different order of seams. It's definitely not the proper way to do it, but you will find that I like doing things the easy and fast way sometimes, not the proper way. And we are fitting the overalls onto Bobby. Put your pants on, boy. And there you can see the final shot after I hand sew the closings on. He still looks very cute, but you can see how this does not fit him as well as the jersey fits Richus, especially down at the bottom towards the legs, and then the pocket just warps everything a little bit. It's still cute and I really enjoy Bobby, but it's definitely not my best work. And then the pocket is kind of falling apart because the seam allowance was just too small. Yeah, there I am pointing out the size difference between the egg and the overalls. This is your reminder to take your time, measure twice, cut once. At the end of the day, though, the amount of detail I put into Bobby and the amount of work I put into his outfit, he is still definitely one of my favorite eggs. Rest in peace, Bobby. After Bobby, then I made Juana Flipa, because you can't have Talene and Bobby without Juana Flipa. So I did that. I killed my hands making those glasses. Stupid, dumb glasses that I had to make again for Geg. I love glasses. Glasses are great. Glasses look great. Making glasses out of fabric, I don't want to do that ever again. So this chronicles Juana Flipa and the terrible, horrible deaths and the stupid, dumb glasses pattern. So as you can see, I started out very similar to Bobby in that I did not measure with a tape measure. Boo! Don't do that. Measure with a tape measure. It's a plush. Use the tape measure. It can get around the curves, I promise. And then I'm just deciding what pieces I need. There was a moment that I was questioning whether I want the glasses to be curved and rounded a little bit, like mine, or if I wanted them to just be blocky, because in canon they are blocks. But with my other plushes, you can see that the pixels got more shape to them. They got more curved, and I could do that with the glasses if I wanted to. It would make sense that bringing them into a physical space, they would get a bit more curved, but I thought they would lose some of their charm. So I stuck with a very, very blocky glasses pattern. I wanted to keep the charm. Like, I wear thick, huge glasses and I love them. I think they're great. They're definitely not for everybody, but it is a stylistic choice. And I do think pushing that stylistic choice to the very edge is interesting. And I think it reminds the viewer that, yeah, these started off more pixelated and the accessories are not meant to be totally realistic, but they're more fantasy still. And since I went with such a blocky design for the glasses, I did end up using my T-square ruler. So shout out for actually using the ruler that I should be using always. We love measuring and using a straight edge and doing things properly. I'm not doing all the lines properly. As you can see, I'm kind of ghosting and sketching in straight lines vertically when I should be doing all of them with the T-square at the edge of the paper. I do choose to curve the sides of the glasses because although I kept the front straight, the edges just looked better curved. If you go and look at the reference that I had where I drew out the side profile of all the eggs, they do angle the pixels in a way that, like, yeah, it makes sense to have them curved. So I am still bringing a little bit more of the real world into the pixelated design, but I'm still keeping the charm. But again, did not measure properly, so the glasses are not as on spec and on model as I would like them to be. And just as a reminder, these videos were taken in 2023. I promise I've grown since then. Oh gosh. And I am just folding the seam allowance up here to see how the glasses are going to look at their actual length and not at their with seam allowance length. And I think I decided that I needed to buff the side pieces out a little bit because they were a little thin. And then you can see time skip. This is after I have gone in, made my curves better, made my thicknesses a little more what I want them to be, made my lines straight, measured at least a little bit on line. I also apologize profusely for the bad camera angles. This was the first time I ever recorded myself doing something like this, and I was not thinking about how much my phone could pick up. And yes, I am still starting with a muslin copy, even though I don't end up changing the glasses too much because they were very simple pattern wise. I still wanted to see what they would look like with just a little bit more thickness than the paper had to offer. And I still needed to decide how I was going to sew them, like what order the seams would go, what would attach to where, how I would sew the eye panels on. All those things get decided in the muslin stage because that is where it's easiest to go back with a seam ripper and redo and try new things and see what works. And again, like the pocket for Bobby, I really should have considered top stitching more, but at this stage in my journey, I really liked hiding seams, and I liked showing people that yes, I can figure out how to make this a plush where you do not need to go and top stitch, and you do not need to go and add stitches after the fact. That is what I was mainly focused on. But of course, I did end up adding stitches after the fact. I should have decided on top stitching, as I said before, but the choice went out to hide the seams over having them visible. And the reason I even needed to decide that is because I was using a very specific plastic. It's still technically a fabric, but it's really not woven out of fibers. It's just a more... Imagine if plastic acted like fabric. That's the material we're working with here. It's very thick, but there's no fibers, and it does have some give to it, like it can be turned and stretched a little bit, but because I was doing that, I was not going to have it double layered as most plush pieces are, where you have two pieces of fabric turned together to cover the wrong side and just to hide the seams. So I needed to figure out a way to add a single panel of this plastic material. And the other part of that is the glasses were so thin, it was very hard to have multiple seams on each side of the glasses. And with that, it was even harder to flip it right side out, especially if you do so many seams at once. So those are some of the issues that I ran into while planning this. What I eventually settled on was sewing the glasses sides together with the front and the back of the main part of the glasses, and then I just sewed on the plastic afterward. Yeah, it would have been more helpful. Again, I mentioned this for the bobby pockets of the overalls. I really should have gone and ironed down my seam allowance before I started hand sewing or stitching it on. But I was doing this over summer, and the thought of ironing anything was not something I really wanted to do. But if you take a moment to prepare and set yourself up for success, it can mean a lot cleaner lines down the line, and it can mean saving yourself a lot of trouble, because it's not like I just freehanded it. I pinned it before, but with the plastic, after you put a pin or a needle through it, it will always show the hole where you sewed through it or pinned through it. Because it's plastic, it doesn't have the fibers to go back into the place it once was. It's just punctured. And also, due to the way I sewed it, I sewed the pieces together first, and then I sewed going around the sides. It means the glasses are almost always open and they don't fold very well or stay folded around Juana Flipa very well. So I really should have done a better job of making sure they were folded properly as glasses. Like, when they are folded, they look pretty good, but the problem is getting the folds to hold, which could be done with like a simple stitch, but I would rather have it be in the pattern. But if I were to change the pattern to make it able to fold, it would probably mean extra pieces. And as I've already talked about, I wanted to keep the piece count low so it's easier to print and do at home. If I ever go back and redo some of the patterns, I would probably go all out and add more pattern pieces for the things that need it, just to account for variability. So then people who want the simple patterns and who want the low piece count can choose the old patterns, and people who want the more complicated and more pieces can choose the new refreshed patterns. But that would only be if people want them. I'm not about to do all that work for just myself. And here you can see me going on to the final copy. I'm using the black felt again. It's just a very cheap fabric to work with, and I had a lot of it left over. And it is a good durable fabric. It does have a little bit of stretch, but it is very thick and durable over time. And if I ever want to go back and needle felt some detail in, it's very easy. I'm folding, trying to get it to be doubled. You can see that I'm reusing the same piece I used for Palm's beret. So yes, I'm redrawing the pieces, so I don't need to plan 4 different places. And also, something useful about flipping the fabric over to cut out pieces is it means you don't have to do a reversal, because you'll already have a reversal of the fabric if you cut out 2 pieces folded on top of each other. Because part of sewing is, if you are sewing 2 pieces together, you want opposite right sides and opposite wrong sides, so the pattern piece needs to be flipped for one of them. So folding the fabric does help with that. Yep, and you can see a few very short seams. I'm just sewing the sides onto the main part, and then I sew them all together, which worked very well. And then I'm just going around the outside, and I'm leaving the inside unsewn so I can go and hand stitch it. If I had done top stitching, this just would have been so much easier. It was really not a difficult pattern at all. So I recommend, if you do this, do top stitching. Or wait until I correct the pattern to make it more viable to close. I don't know. You do you. And there's the forceps pulling out the endings. And because the inside is unsewn, it's really easy to just bring the sides through. And then I'm just pushing the fabric back into place. You can also do this with an iron, but sometimes I'll just do it with my hands. I'm trying to flatten out the seams and push the fabric back to where it should be, because sometimes when you flip it out, things get stuck. And then I'm going and I'm pinning my plastic panels and my seam allowance down. Oh, and this part is interesting. This is about actually making the Juana Flipa egg. So the fabric I originally had for all of the eggs, I knew I didn't have enough to make all of them with the same fabric. So I had this brilliant idea to take scraps of the fabric and sew them together to create a patchwork, because I thought it would give the illusion of cracking. And what better egg to have a patchwork and cracking on than Juana Flipa, who died not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, but 5 times. So she has a lovely cracked egg that suits her very well. And you can see her with her glasses. They don't stay on very well. As I said, the arms of the glasses don't stay flattened very well. But she is a cutie patootie. And she did not deserve all of the heartache. Shout out to the sweeping edge glitch. And now she can chill with her bestie Talene. So Juana Flipa was 5, and Leonardo was 6. Hated the baseball cap. Never make your own baseball cap. Just buy it. It's not worth it. It doesn't come out good, but it's definitely not the best accessory. And if I was to make it again for Leo, I would probably do a mushroom head. I wanted to do one anyway, I just never got around to it, which is a common theme in my sewing, never getting around to it. I think out of all the decisions I made in this project, the jump between Juana Flipa's glasses that I spent over an hour hand stitching to then go onto Leo's baseball cap, which I had no business sewing, that has got to be one of the worst decisions of this entire project. Because when I tell you how much I hated sewing and patterning this goddamn baseball cap, it is the understatement of the year to say my distaste for it. So like always, I started with a small sketch and sketching out the pattern I would need, and you can see that I do have measurements with it, but you will also see soon enough that I screw the measurements entirely. I have no idea what I did, I have no idea where I got the math that I did. All I know is I messed up and this is not correct. Obviously, I have baseball caps I can reference. I can reference patterns of it online. It's very visible what they are made out of, but I made so many errors that I just did not want to deal with in the moment because I was so tired from all the hand stitching from the glasses, and I was so tired of curves and getting things to fit. You can see that I am doing a lot of math to get a good shape for the dome part of the baseball cap right here. I can't tell you exactly what math I was doing, but basically I needed to make sure I could get 6 segments that could all come together and make 360 degrees, so it would be a circle. So that is why I was splitting it up like this. So I already had a compass that I was using to make circles with and to do seam allowance because I can just lock it to the measurement I need and trace, so they're very good for seam allowances, but they are also primarily to make circles and curves with. I know I was doing some math, but I could not tell you what math I was doing. This is just... Was it to make sure the lines were the same length? They're not going through the middle. I have no idea. I have no idea what was going through my head. This just isn't how math works. This isn't how semispheres work. Is the This isn't how domes work. That's not how hat patterns work. There are so many better ways I could have gone about this. And truly, this right here, drawing the flap for the baseball cap, that is where I messed up the most. I should have matched the angle to that of the hat. I should have just drawn it huge so I could get the actual circle I was working with, and that would have helped me so much. I should have drawn the actual circle I wanted the cap to be, the circumference of Leonardo's egg's head, because then it would have actually been a circle. And also, with the cap, having it flat like that just means that the front of the baseball cap, or back, depending on which way you put it, the flap part just sticks up and wants to stand straight up because it does not go with the curve of the hat. It does not fit well. I used a piece of plate for structure to keep it straight, and it's just, since it's a flat edge going up against the curve, it just does not fit well, and they fight. The flat edge and the curve fight for which structure is going to be used, and when it's on Leo's head, the straight edge loses, so the baseball cap flap just warps over time and it doesn't sit how it's supposed to. And then because I didn't measure properly for the segments of the ball cap dome part, they just don't round off enough. They just wrinkle. And there is a lot of top stitching in this, I will say, because I always speak about how much I don't like visible seams. Baseball caps are something where you do have a lot of top stitching in the actual referenced part. So I did include top stitching, but a lot of my lines around the binding were not straight and not consistent, which makes the whole thing feel a little wonkier. And also, I never quite sewed down where I put the button, because that's something I was like, yes, I'll just add this after the fact. I didn't put too much thought into it, so it became auxiliary and not polished. There are definitely ways that I know I can improve this looking back, but in the moment, I was definitely stuck. Yes, so if you see the cap right now, you'll see it's like flower petals. It doesn't go smooth like a curve, which it would have had I started with a circle that was the right circumference. There's just so many problems with this accessory. And you can see I'm adding a binding now just to see if it'll help. Like, it is doing a good job at masking the flower petals, but it doesn't fit. You can see that it doesn't fit on Leo's head. I should have started from scratch. That is not how a hat is supposed to fit. And then I'm cutting the top off because I'm like, I'll just put the button there so it doesn't even matter. It does matter. Do it right. I should have started over. This is why you want to approach projects with a fresh mind and not an annoyed mind. When you approach things with an annoyed mind, you let things go and you don't do your best work. And you end up making something that has more problems than it is worth. Also, measure twice, cut once, and don't do stupid math that doesn't make sense when you look back at it. I don't even know what I was doing. And like, you can see that I cleaned up my lines a little bit and decreased the curve at the end, but it's still not going to be enough to make it as flat as I want it to be. This is just the disaster accessory. I beg of you, if nothing else, even if you love Leo so much, do not make this accessory. I will leave the pattern up, but I swear, leave a comment and I'll redo it. I'm not proud of this one. I just need to know the time commitment is worth it. Just tell me. Tell me and I'll fix it. This one, it's not worth it. You can look at the pattern, you can download it. Don't make it. Save yourself. We are including this in the video just for posterity's sake, so I don't make this horrible, horrible line of decisioning again. And we are going to keep it honest. We are going to be honest about what this project looked like, what it actually meant, what it was actually like, and the decisions I actually made. We are not going to glamorize. We are not going to gloss over. This is not the Gilded Age. This is the age of truthfulness and taking accountability. And now on the screen, you can see what the final muslin copy looked like. Or was that the first one? I don't know, because they both look terrible. Absolutely terrible, horrible. Leo, you deserve so much better than this. She was such an amazing egg. They were a star, absolutely phenomenal. And I'm just going with it. Also, shout out my X-Acto knife. I love my X-Acto knife. It's very useful for cutting plates and getting smooth edges so I don't cut myself on paper. But also, if you are young, have an adult do this for you. Scissors definitely work just as well. X-Acto knives are very useful and lovely to use in art, but you have to be using them safely. So this is a very good pattern to use when cutting out triangles so you don't waste a lot of material. I hate having fabric waste. I save all my fabric waste so I can use it either as stuffing or as scraps to do patchwork. So I will say, I don't think I measured the edges of the baseball cap dome pieces to make sure that they fit the circumference I was going for. So that is also something of an error that should be noted. Also, I want to point out my scissors that I'm using. I'm using gingham scissors, which are very expensive and very high quality. And my college, that I paid a lot of money. I have very expensive student loans. My scissors that I'm using were part of a set that my college gave to my class. So we got sewing materials for our sewing class. Thank you so much for that, by the way, school. One of the very awesome things that they did for me was give me a lot of materials. Like, it definitely costed me in terms of tuition, but it was so amazing just getting all of these supplies. That's where I got the forceps from as well. My college just like bought it for us so we could have the best supplies, and that was amazing. Yep, so you can see here it's still a flat edge, and that is going to bite me in the butt so many times. So I just can't fit the cardboard in because I put it right up against the seam allowance, and since I did not iron the seam allowance flat, the seam allowance gets stuck on the plate board. And there I am just sewing it on. Oh, wait, no, I'm starting to sew the dome together, and you can see that I am starting with just a simple seam allowance, and then I will go back and I will top stitch it after everything is together. I am starting to realize that top stitching, kind of goated, kind of really good thing, adds a lot of detail, makes seams easier. I'm starting to think there's something to this top stitching thing. But yeah, it's a very quick process. It's just sewing a bunch of triangles together. Felt is a very thick material though, so it's just something that you have to be careful with on your machine. And because I did such a small seam allowance, my top stitching is very close to my seam. But yeah, it's growing, we're getting there. I'm going to complain about this accessory the whole time. You can see more. I'm going to continue calling it pedaling because it's when the bottom of the triangles go out against the edge and you can see that they don't butt against each other and make a nice circle. It's like the petals of a flower instead, which is not what you're going for in a baseball cap because it's going to make my seam uneven when I sew in the binding. And you can just see how it's already sticking up. Like, the baseball cap flap is already sticking up the wrong way. Leo, you deserve better. So I am looking at the eggs as I record this, and I am realizing that I put some of the legs on the thin side of the egg, which would be actually the top part of the egg and not the bottom part. So another mistake to mention while we're on the topic of mistakes. This is going so well. I'm learning so much just looking at these back. I guess recording your process is really good for growth. Oh my gosh, this is like VOD watching. MCSR VOD watching, but it's learning all of my mistakes about sewing. Okay, I should have sewed this seam before I started sewing the binding on. There is no reason I should be sewing these pieces together after they are already sewn on the ball cap. That is just bad management of order. That is just poor planning. Yeah, and you can see me going in with the seam ripper because it's poor planning and it's gonna mess everything up. Come on, Bixie Bee. Think ahead. Ugh. At least I'm going in with pins here. Pins make everything easier. When you talk to somebody who sews clothes, they're going to say pin every half an inch. If you are sewing for a doll or a plush, don't listen to that. Pin as much as you need to. I have made stuff where I have had a pin every, I want to say, eighth of an inch. As long as you take the pins out before you sew over them, it will be okay. You just want things to lay flat enough and connected enough for you to have the right seam allowance without warping the fabric. If you are pulling pieces of fabric together to sew them, it is not going to work and it is not going to look pretty. Also, I think I should have sewed the baseball cap flap after the binding, or like in the middle of the binding. I don't know, it looks wrong being on top of the binding, but that could just be the flat edge. Yeah, maybe if it was curved, it'd be a bit better. This is one of the accessories that could have benefited from another muslin model. Could have benefited a lot. Yep, you can see it go on. The flap is not how I want it to be. It is lying flat. It is not standing up straight. I'm going and I'm trying to fix what I can and add the button, but the button just isn't going to look great because it's an afterthought. It's so... It's definitely the ugliest accessory that I've made. Like, out of all the accessories, Leo's is the ugliest. I've made with no comparison to the rest. There's no other word besides wonky to describe how, like, unfinished and unpolished it is. I should not have gone to a hard pattern after Juana Flipa. That was on me. I'm so sorry, Leo. I have done a grave injustice to the doozers. Oh my god. I promise I did not mean to. I love Leonarda. Leo is a fantastic egg, and I love queer rep, and I love that they taught foolish Spanish. They're an amazing egg, amazing admin. Oh my gosh, this is such a bad pattern. Oh, I'm so sorry. You can see how bad my seam lines are. Do you see how those seam lines connect? Oh my god. Oh my god. I should not be allowed to make hats. I need to be stopped. Quackity Studios, sue me. This is not right. Oh, Leo. Oh gosh. Rest well, King. It looks like the top of a fire hydrant. It's not even finished inside the flap. Oh my gosh. After manipulating it for so many years and trying to get it to stay out, it kind of can, but you see how it warps the dome. It's so ugly inside. You can see the button. Oh my gosh. Oh, Leo, I'm so sorry. And then, Leo, what are you going to have next to her? You're going to have Trumpet. And this was a fun hat to make. I really enjoy getting to use a lot of colors, and I really enjoy getting to do fun, silly projects. And the propeller hat is definitely a fun, silly project. But with that being said, there were some definite hiccups in the road, most of which I invited into the project by making some not so great decisions early on, including using Leo's hat for a base. If you have watched this in chronological order, you are probably sitting here wondering how I went from dissing the last accessory so bad to using it as a base for trumpets. And the answer is very simple. I'm lazy, and that is the answer. There are so many things I could have done better to make trumpets accessory, the propeller hat, more accurate, better looking, and more polished. Using Leonardo's cap as a base does none of these things. In fact, it only makes it worse. However, it is a time save, and I was burnt out. So this is probably another egg accessory that I should remake. There is definitely a correct way that I should have done this, which would again be measuring the circumference of the crown of the egg that I was going to use and drawing a circle that big and dividing it into equal parts. But instead, I did not do that. I took an easy solution and it made the overall product worse. I did not even separate the baseball cap muslin copy that I used to get my pattern pieces for Trumpet's hat. I did not separate it properly. So it wasn't even equal to the reference I used because I was using 16 of these parts and they were way too big, and it just made the whole hat gigantic. It is, of course, going to turn out better than Leonardo's hat because it does not have the dum-dum flap from hell that warps the whole hat when it moves. And there are ways that I could have fixed it. I could have done a little gathering stitch. I could have added an elastic band to hold it on better. The propeller looks okay, but it's definitely still going to feel unpolished and not fit the way it should, which is disappointing because when you're spending so much time and material on something, you really should be trying your best. But I was so focused on getting all of the eggs done by a certain time frame that I had already fallen behind and was burnt out, so I just cut corners, which isn't in the end making me waste more materials overall. But we live and we learn, and it does come out looking better than Leo's. It has personality to it, and it doesn't fit well, but it's still cute, and I think it still shows the type of egg that Trumpet was. And of course, doing the muslin copy, like I colored in the muslin for this one just so I could see how the order looks and see how they all fit together, and I think it was a really smart decision on my end. And I probably shouldn't have included the paper plate structure in the propeller wings because it does weigh it down, as you will see, but it does look like a propeller hat. So we are cutting, cutting, cutting a lot of very small pieces. And you can see that I'm holding my scissors up to do this, which is not really the correct way to cut fabric, as I mentioned before. But when it's pieces that are this small, you can kind of get away with it without warping the fabric too much. And the lines that you're cutting are much smaller, so it makes a little more sense. I will be using felt for the hat because, again, cheap, and it comes in a variety of colors and the texture will all be the same, which is another reason why using felt is good, because it's a very good way to match textures in materials while still having different colors and being able to afford to have as many colors as you need. It also means that I don't have to worry about the binding that much because it won't fray. But the propellers are made out of a different material. It's made out of a lightweight white material that I eventually used to make, I think it would be like third generation eggs. It was like Pepito, and I don't know if I made an egg for empanada, but I definitely made one for Pepito. But you can see me sewing it together here. I'm kind of figuring out the best way to attach the propellers because I have to attach the propellers to the propeller stand, and then I have to attach the stand to the hat. So I need to make sure that all the fabric is turned right side out. I think I did this by folding the propellers and then folding the seam allowance over. You can really seal the propellers in, and then you'll just having an opening at the bottom of the propeller stand, so you're not really closing it fully. But you could go and just like sew something underneath the hat if you wanted to seal it, because I do use stuffing to hold the propeller up. I don't know if I'll show this in the muslin model, but I did figure out how to get the propellers there. And I will say the propeller is off center in my final model. I did not plan it out well enough to get it to a satisfying center, and the way I sewed all of the strips together left them feeling unequal. And the stand for the propeller is just very thick, so it's not a very aesthetically balanced final piece. But of course, you'll see more about this when I finish sewing all the stripes together. It is becoming more of a dome shape, and for this I care less about the pedaling because there's just so many strips. It would be really difficult to get it to be a perfect circle all lined up. But you can start to see that, yeah, all the stripes aren't equal, and some of the points to the stripes are getting hid and some of them aren't, just because of the way that I sewed it. I sewed it in sections, I believe. Alright, so here we are with my seam ripper, taking out a seam because it didn't line up the way I wanted it to. Working with this many pieces, there are 16 strips of colors that all go together to make the hat. So working with that many, you are definitely bound to make mistakes. I definitely do think the strips are too big though. It would be harder with smaller strips, but just the way that they all fall together, they really should have been smaller. But I wanted to keep it canon, and Canon Trumpet's hat has 16 colors, but I could have measured better. That was definitely on me. Oopsie. Oh, so there are tools that you can use on Adobe, and I'm pretty sure on Inkscape, that can give you rotational symmetry. So I really could have just created the pattern in an online program and have it been a lot easier. And then here I am making another bad decision because this just weighs down the hat so much. Although I do still stand by my use of my X-Acto knife, it makes the edges really smooth and I don't cut myself on them. So shout out. And then here I am actually going in with the actual colors. You can see that I only did one muslin copy, and with that, even when it didn't fit, I still decided it was time to move on to the final draft. Again, bad decision. Although I do love how bright the colors are. I think out of all the accessories, trumpets is definitely one of the funnest, just design-wise. Because having such a big stock of black and white fabrics is nice. Like, I enjoy when I can use fabrics that I already have, but getting to make something with such fun colors just brings me a lot of joy. And I end up reusing the leftover felt for a project I made after college. Like, they're fun colors. And you can see that I'm actually cutting them nicely, or at least some of them I'm cutting them nicely, trying to make an effort to keep the bottom of my scissors on the cutting mat and keep the scissors steady as I cut to have a cleaner cut line. Because cutting them properly, you may not think it matters that much because you are sewing the seams to not be visible. But since I'm using a quartering foot to line up my seams, like cutting it matters so much because you're using the cut line to match where your seam is. You're not like drawing a seam and picking where it goes. You're like using the cut to determine where your seam is going to go, which is why it's so important to draw it and cut it nicely so you have a clean line, so your seam is going to be straight and clean as well. Like, all of these factors play into each other. And here we are, we're going to start sewing it. I did have to cut off a little bit of the propeller because when I made Leo's hat, I remembered to mark the flap to have a shorter one for the internal structure, but I forgot to do that for the internal structure of the propellers. But since I free-handed it, it also like butts up against the seam allowance in a strange way. I really should have ironed the seam allowance flat before using internal structures, but again, summer, lazy, there's many factors that explain why I did not do that. You can see that I'm sewing the groups of strips in the same groups each time, and this means that each time, starting with the red to orange to green to blue, so blue in all of my strips just has more of like the tip of the strip because it's not being sewn off. It's just the way it is when you sew it in groups as opposed to sewing it in one long strip and then closing it. I do recommend not doing the groups and just sewing them one after the other, because then your center will be much cleaner. And you can see my propeller support and how thick it is. How I'm sewing the end. I'm going pretty slowly because there is a lot of fabric there, but that's basically what I did. You couldn't really see where the propellers ended. I probably should have pulled the end of the propellers down further to really seal it in the seam, but that is how I closed the top of the propellers, just one straight seam over everything. And then I'm adding the binding, and I should have pinned this more. I really should have, to make it more even, but I am going around the corners and I'm going to go and clip them off so the binding is flatter, but that's why it was okay about the pedaling, because I was just working around that. But it did make the hat uneven because I didn't mark it or anything, and the edge wasn't even to begin with, so I was just guessing where the edge would be, and at this point I should have folded the seam allowance of the binding and ironed it flat so I would have a nice place to do my top stitching, because binding, you go and you do top stitching because there's not really a good way to like stitch it internally. and you can see that it's not even. It should be way closer to the edge. You don't want it to be in the middle of the binding, you want it to be like right next to the edge. It's just too visible. And now I'm going and I'm doing a really small, tight seam in the inside to sew my propeller onto the hat base. And it is not centered well enough, so it is very lopsided. I apologize. Trumpet already went through so much. I'm not even calling him the proper name this whole video because I refuse, but it's just, ugh. Also, my apologies about the bad camera angles and the fabric getting in the way of the camera. That is definitely something I will keep in mind if I make more of these. But yeah, you can see it's kind of cute. It doesn't fit the best. It doesn't surround the cap a way a fitted cap should. It falls off. It's very top heavy. It can stand up a little bit because the base is so thick. That is why the base is so thick in the first place, so it can stand up a little bit. But definitely the internal structure inside the propellers makes it heavier than it needs to be. And I should have measured correctly to make the hat fit. But rest in peace. I would say you will be missed, but for the most part, Trumpet was forgotten. So rest peacefully. So Trumpet was 7, Lula is 8th. So this was before certain events had come to light. So I do still have her in brown hair and a red cap, but later she was changed to have black hair and a purple cap to match Filza and Misa a little more. But I'm not going to redo it. It is what it is. I waited too long to make this video. Things happen. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start. So unlike the previous patterns I've shown you, I did not make a sketch of what I wanted to do first. I had figured out in my head that to get the look that Lula has of the hair and the beanie, I thought it would be best if I just layered pieces of double-sided fleece. I layered the fleece to create the illusion of hair, and then I just looked at a beanie I already owned and made a very similar pattern. So that was just referenced, and you can see me doing the beanie now. I do one draft of it and it looks amazing because I referenced a real beanie and I just go with it. It was a very quick process. It looks good. I'm very proud with the solution I found to Lula's design. I think it was very creative, although it's something that you can only really do with fabrics that don't fray. For the beanie, you can add a hem to it, but for the hair, it would look a little bit silly if you were to do just one layer. You would need to double up the layers of fabrics and sew them together to get a similar effect. And I've said before how I didn't want to have the accessories permanently stuck on the eggs. I wanted people to be able to change them out, so you would only really have to make one egg and you could just change the accessories on that. So I did not sew down the hair on Lula. If you are going to make this yourself, I would recommend sewing down the hair because it just falls off all the time. Not like random layers of it falling off, but it's just very top heavy, so the beanie will like drag the hair back and it'll just all fall off all at once if you move it too much. You can also see me cutting the beanie. You would think it's more circular to get the beanie shape, but it's actually a lot of different darts sewn together. You have two little ones on the side and then one big one matching up to where the big long seam is. And then you can see I did a muslin copy. I didn't show me cutting out the muslin for the hair, but it looks pretty cute, so I just went with it. Nothing big. Very fun pattern to do. Would be very easy to trade out with black hair and purple. There are many people who wear beanies. Beanies are very popular. As I said, I used a beanie I already had for my pattern in reference to that. Those of us who have had an emo phase, or an emo not a phase mom, know that beanies are very popular, and We should not let the fashion of one bad human make us think that beanies are bad. Quackity wears a beanie. It does not need to be associated with the person who it's commonly associated with. I'll say that. Also, you can see in this that I did add a little more shape to the pattern for the hair. The long left piece, I added a little bit more texture and design just to make it a little wavier. At first, I was going very blocky, but I decided with hair, I wanted it to be a little more hair-like. But yeah, you can just see me cutting the last bits out. I'm sewing the beanie here, so I'm just doing the darts. It'll be 2 of the small ones, 1 of the longer ones, and then the big seam. It does suck because like the brown and the maroon look really good together, and then like I don't want to redo it because I don't want to have to pay for the new colors of fabric, but also the black and the purple are just like not as warm as the brown and the maroon. And Lula is such a warm and compassionate character. Just seeing the color transition from these warm colors to this very cool shade of black and purple. I feel like I understand why they chose them to fit Misa, but also I feel like there was just a disconnect from the character. I don't know. Lore-wise, it made sense, but aesthetics-wise, it was not my favorite. But yeah, I love Lula as an egg. She was so fun. The little flute and like all the lore that she did, she brought such like good interactions on the server. I'm glad that her egg turned out good. You can see her here all finished. It was so quick and easy. I definitely should have made her before, probably after Juana Flipa, but I did want to make her really close together with when I made Cheyenne, and I knew Cheyenne would be one of the last eggs that I made just because of how complicated his accessory is. I didn't want Lula hanging out all by herself for too long, so that's kind of why I waited. Yeah, I think the layers looked really nice all together. They came out very clear, like they do blend together because they're the same color, but that's the illusion I was going for, and it does add the volume without being filled with stuffing. The back of the egg also looks pretty good. It was just a very nice break from all the other eggs that I was working on. We love you, Lula. I love her. She's fantastic. I hope she's eating something other than avocado toast right now. 9th and 10th, I made these about the same time. Dapper and Ramon, like 2 peas in a pod. You have to make them both together. Of the 2, I did start with Dapper first. 1, because I had made a top hat before in high school. I didn't include it in any of my previous videos because it was more sculptural than plush, but I also really enjoy Dapper as somebody who watched a lot of Bad Boy Halo. He was probably one of my main POVs. I watched a lot of his streams, especially as I was sewing all of the eggs and patterning and doing all the stuff for this project. Here I am mismeasuring again. Instead of using the tape measure that we know I have, I am pushing down on an egg and marking only the sides, not even doing a full circle. Oh my gosh, I'm so good at this. So precise. Thank you, past Bixie Bee. It is a miracle the top hat fit as well as it will. But yeah, Dapper and Ramon together were iconic duo. You can see that a lot of the order that I chose to do the eggs in as well was also with duos, like Palm and Richus, Trumpet Leo, Dapper Ramon, Talene and Juana Flipa were separated, but I do like their duo as well. So it was a mixture of factors really for which ones I did. But a top hat, very simple. You have the top circle, and that will be the top of your top hat, and then you have a very big long rectangle that wraps around the circle. So the length of the rectangle will be the same length as the circumference of the top circle. And then then the height of the rectangle will be the height that you want the top hat, and then you will have a circle with a hole in it, and that will be the brim. And you'll cut out 2 of the circles with a hole in it. The internal hole should be just about the same size as the top circle of the top hat, but the seam allowance goes other ways. The top circle will have seam allowance going outwards, and the circle with a hole in it, the hole will have seam allowance going inside the circle. So they'll be about 1/2 inch different in size if you're going with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. There's also a ribbon on Dapper's hat. The ribbon, I simply cut some of the red ribbon I had bought for Talene and just sewed it to make a circle and put it over the top hat. That's why it falls off. It's not even sewn on. It's one seam on the ribbon, called it a day. It fell off his top hat when I took the new photos of him, but you can see it very well in the old one. You can also see that I'm doing 2 birds, 1 stone. I'm using the same circle for both the top circle and the brim circle with a hole in it. Also, props to me for using my T-square for this one and using it properly. It's lined up against the paper's edge. That's how it should be. Yeah, so after I finish drawing this, I'm going to scan it and put all my pattern pieces in then Adobe Illustrator and lay them out on paper in a way that I can print them with the sizes the way that it is for the top hat. I'm definitely going to utilize pattern pieces that are cut on fold. Cut on fold will have arrows pointing to the edge of the pattern piece, and when there's arrows pointing to the edge of the pattern piece, that means to cut on a fold. So you do not cut the fold when you're done with it, you cut on a fold, so when you unfold the fabric, it's twice the size. It's very cool shorthand. All right. And now we are going to jump ahead to the finished project. You do not get to see me sewing or cutting on Dapper because I have unfortunately lost those videos. The hat kind of deflates a little bit because I did not put a lining in the middle section. You definitely could line it, or I think if you used 2 sheets of fleece and made it double thickness, it would stand up better. But I also didn't want it to be too heavy, and I still wanted it to be very like soft and plushy like and not too hat like. So I think it does a good job for what it is. And I will say I also put another part of a paper plate in the rim of the hat for this one because I knew it needed structure, and that was the affordable structure that I thought would be best. I wanted to show that even with cheap materials you can still do this. Yes, there are better interfacing and better materials to put inside a plush to keep it upright, but you can do it with cheap materials and it can still be good. You can see it a little bit better on the white background. But yes, we love Dapper, and here he is with the ribbon. I think that the red ribbon adds a lot to the look. I'll also show you him with another project I did where I made a scythe because Dapper always has a weapon on him, at least one, and it's typically the scythe. So, yippee! Yay, Dapper! So now we are going to go on to Ramon. As you can see, I did this directly after making Dapper's hat. I even used the same paper. I just used the bottom part, and you can see I only drew one shape. That is because Ramon is very easy. His mustache is symmetrical, which means I can use the same pattern for both sides of it. And since we wanted to have a little bit of stuffing just to bring the middle of the mustache alive a little bit more, I am going to make it double-sided, but since it's double-sided, we just used the same pattern piece flipped. So it's going to be the same piece 4 times. As you can see, I have a little dart down at the end just to give it a little more liveliness and a 3D aspect right at the end. But it is a very simple pattern piece. It is one piece cut out 4 times. You're going to stitch opposite sides together for one side, opposite sides together for the other side, sew it in the middle, and then I'm going to leave a little opening on the back side so I can attach it to a button that I sewed on an egg because again, can. I want these to be removable so you can remove them from the eggs. And then I used a clear button so it's not really visible. If you only want one egg, then the button can be covered up easily, or you can replace the button with maybe a safety pin. And that could also work for making sure it's removable. One fun part about it being on a button is you can just spin it around and flip it, which is very fun. You could also just ladder stitch it to the egg. All of these accessories you can keep as removable, or you can also just sew them on. You can sew the pieces stationary so they don't move, and you can just have them stuck on one egg. Sewing it is going to go really easily. I said before sewing the sides together first and then both sides together in the middle. You could also do it the other way and sew the middles together and just sew all the way around the sides. That would be pretty smart if you want to keep the back stitched together. I did use fleece for this, so it is very soft, but it also means that it will not fray too much, which is why I had the ability to keep the opening in the back. If you're going to use a fabric that frays, keeping an opening in the back, you're probably going to have to do a little bit of a hem around the opening to make sure that you protect the seams. So here I am going in. Since it is a mustache, it does have a lot of curves, and something I haven't talked about too much is clipping curves. When you're sewing curves to get turned inside out, you really want to clip them at corners or really sharp curves, or else they won't turn inside out properly. You see this a lot in clothing for armhole seams. They clip curves a lot. You don't want to do the full seam. You want to do about half the seam. So since I use a quartering foot, you would make a little cut about 1/8 of the way down. If you are using pinking shears instead of sewing hems together, that is something that people who sew clothes use to seal a hem. If you use those, then you obviously wouldn't need to seal the hem as much. But it came out really good. It's very close to the original. I was also thinking about making Ramona hat like I was Leo, but obviously that didn't happen due to a number of reasons. But I'm glad that I got to make both of the technology brothers. Shout out Ramon and Dapper. I love them. I usually keep their eggs together. They're adorable, and they came out so good. 10 was Cheyenne, and then Cheyenne was one of the last ones I did just because of how complex the pattern was. It is a very silly, goofy looking duck inner ring, but I think it came out cute. He's a very important egg in lore, and he deserves a more complex pattern. Alright, for Cheyenne, we are going to skip the small little sketch phase and we are going to go right to the pattern pieces. This is so smart. Thank you, Bixie. So you can see I'm just ghosting in lines right now. I'm going over. Here I am finally making some small sketches. This was definitely a very confusing pattern for me to do because I was unsure how I wanted to go about it. There are a lot of things that work in tandem in this pattern to bring the inner ring to life. I am going back to using my T-square ruler, but as you can see, I am not taking as many measurements as I should. So there are some parts of the inner ring that are going to turn out to be out of proportion. The wings and the tail, that's what I originally drew, just don't live up to the scale of the inner ring, and that is something I wish I spent more time on in the design phase, just making sure the ratios were all similar. we are skipping ahead. As I have said, I've lost some videos, so we are skipping the muslin cutting out stage and going right into sewing the first muslin draft. This is going to be a wing, and one of the things I really needed to test out on the muslin copy was how I was going to get the detail. There are a number of ways that you can go over and add detail to a wing. If you look at a plush, they probably, if they have like a wing or a paw, you'll see some detail to give shape to like the feathers and the paws. There's a number of ways to do it. It usually involves top stitching or using some embroidery thread. I didn't really like how mine came out. I think I could have done a better job with it. Maybe used a different color, maybe looked at some more references. I ended up doing just top stitching across the wing in between the top feather and the bottom feather, and yes, it helps differentiate between the two, but it's just not dramatic enough and it's not smooth enough to really add enough detail. I probably should have satin stitched instead of straight stitched it to add a little bit more, but I really should have just gone in with embroidery floss of a different color. Yeah, definitely going in with embroidery probably would have been the best solution. Also, the wings, the feathers aren't the most even, so I probably would have gone and tried to fix that as well. Just worked on it a little bit more. You can see me here working on the duck face. I referenced a teddy bear face for this of a pattern I have. My idea was the beak is kind of like the snout to a bear, just a little bit differently shaped, so I could reference the bear to have a good jumping off point for the bird face. There are definitely things that still could be changed. The back of the head is just not as even and smooth as I would like it. It probably needs to go out just a little bit more onto the inner ring. And then the beak is something that just needed an auxiliary stitch or a better muzzle tie to keep it in shape because it just doesn't stay as it should. And you can see here how I actually have notches to line up my pattern pieces. That's something that I don't typically include in my own patterns because I know where things line up in my head. I should probably include them more often, and I am starting to do that, but that is a sure sign that I'm referencing another pattern. But again, I'm not just using the same pattern pieces. I am looking at measurements and how I can change it to fit what I need it to be. It's not just taking a one-to-one copy. And you can see here that it definitely looks more like a bear, but I'm trying to get the muzzle into a beak shape. And then I decide it's not worth it to alter the muzzle into a beak, so I start going to design my own beak using a process that I first learned about on TikTok. We didn't really go over anything like this in any of my sewing classes. Basically, I start with a clay called plasticina, which is a clay that never hardens, and I make a draft of what I want the beak to look like out of that, and then I cover it in plastic wrap and then tape, and then I can cut the tape off and have a pretty accurate pattern piece. And then here are pattern pieces that are more altered. You can't really see the ways I altered them because I left the notches on, but I altered the neck, I altered where the muzzle goes, I altered the sizes, obviously, and ratios. I did not need that big of a forehead for this, so I cut some of the forehead back and tried to make it more roundish instead of like teddy bears is really all in the front of the face. I wanted it to be pretty even between the front and the back. And then you can see my wings and tails, which honestly do look pretty big, but when you factor in seam allowance to them, they lost a lot of their like width. So as much as I did like reference the ratios I had on my turnaround views, like they just don't look big enough in comparison when you're holding it in person. Or maybe the better problem was my inner tube ring itself was just too big because it needed to be able to go over the egg. Right, so there's still just a lot of things that I can improve in this pattern. I think all patterns have a lot that could be improved, but there were just so many pieces and aspects to Cheyenne's. And making this last, I was already very at the end of my energy, but just spreading that energy onto so many different aspects of it just meant that the whole was worse overall. And obviously, in hindsight, like I can see that and I can see the mistakes I was making in hindsight watching this back. But in the moment, like I was proud of the effort that I put through, and I still am. I put a lot of effort into this project, and as sad as it is that I don't stand by and love all the patterns I made still, it to me it shows growth. And I think that's what's important, seeing the growth and seeing that yes, even though I spent so much time and energy on this, there are still ways to improve it. Even now, only 3 years later, I can see ways I can improve it and see ways that I should have thought about then but just weren't on my mind. But you can see the face coming together. And it is cool to see like all the pieces come to life. And I think relying on like citing patterns and looking at how other people had solved problems, I think that was definitely growth for me in this project. Like after Leo, I decided like yes, I should be referencing other people's patterns and seeing how they solve this, because at my skill level for this, I just did not have the know-how to solve these problems I was dealing with. Here I am finally making a muslin copy of the tube itself. And I do really want to talk about this because this is something that I realized while I was doing the muslin copy, which is why it's important to do muslin copies, is I had to do this in a very specific order, because in inner tube you cannot turn out the typical way you can turn out like stuffed animals. Like there's a hole inside of it, so if you try to turn it out with the inner hole closed, it's not going to work. You're going to have a stuck circle inside your pattern piece with no way to turn it out. So you either need to turn it out as a long tube, And so one section of it closed hand stitching, or you need to sew just the outer ring and then you flip it out from the inner ring. That would work because you're not having a closed section of space in the pattern. So that's definitely something that I hadn't considered until the muslin copy. You can see me thinking about it right now. I'm like, how am I going to flip this out? It's something that doesn't occur to you unless, one, you really enjoy physics, or two, you're making a muslin copy and suddenly you're like, oh, I'm stuck. Which is also why in later projects after college, I start recording the order which I sew things together. So I just have a record of, if I get stuck, I can look back and be like, oh, I need to change when I sew this, or oh, I need to figure out how to do this in a better way. And yeah, you can see that I eventually went with the tube. I decided I'll just leave one end not stuck, and you can see me with a seam ripper trying to figure out how I wanted to solve this problem in my version of Cheyenne. And yeah, without it being stuffed, you can go and sew like at least half of one end after the fact, but you need to be sure that you're done stitching the inside. So for Cheyenne, that means that the head needed to be done first, and then the wings needed to be done, and then the inner tube, which you would sew the head and the wings on, and then you would, I think, baste the tail on and then flip it inside out. So this is the pattern piece I was using for the beak. It's not the best, and it does stretch out. Like, it's not a professional way to make a pattern piece doing with the plastic wrap and the tape, but it is very helpful, especially for when you are just like prototyping and trying things out. Also, I used felt for it, and I used fleece for the rest of the inner tube. So definitely having those materials working together, like fleece is a very stretchy material and felt can warp a lot. So those materials going together was not the best choice. And also, I should have done another muslin copy, as I talked about. You also don't need to do a full muslin copy every time you need to make a change. You can do just a muslin copy of one part. You don't even have to have it connecting fully to a part. You can cut your pattern so you can only see the part of the pattern that you're worried about. Like, you don't need to do a full 360s of stuffed animal if you just want to focus on the wing. I could have made like 8 copies of a wing until I was happy. I could have made 10 copies of a head until I was happy. I could have made 20 copies of a tail. And that just means less work overall trying to fix like one part of something every time, and it means less fabric waste. And you can reuse muslin. Like, you definitely can take apart your muslin models and reuse them, or you can save them for later for another project that you want to do. I really should have taken the notches out at this point in the color copy, because the amount that I like moved the pattern piece around, they definitely don't match up anymore, which is probably why the head was a little off center and did not match up the best. I'm realizing this now because I just moved around parts of the pattern so much that the notches didn't really add anything or help with anything. I did take them off in the final pattern, but I did not when I was cutting this. So that's definitely an oof. Oh gosh. I look at these eggs and like I do not have time to redo all of them right now, nor materials, but eventually I would love to go back and fix all the mistakes. And also, these black felt pieces are for the eyes. I ended up needle felting them on. As you can tell, I really like needle felting. I think it's really good for mostly like art plush pieces, but the needle felting in this case did not work great because you can see where the needle felted felt goes onto the fleece. Needle felting is better for like felt on felt or felt on like the material of the egg. It has a very short fibers and it's woven, so the felt fibers go in really well to like the spaces between the woven fibers, which is why palm looks pretty good, but the duck head does not. I really should have gone and like satin stitched it. And for those of you who don't know what a satin stitch is on a sewing machine, if you put it on a zigzag stitch and you put the width between stitches to a very low number, it's usually like 0.1 or 0.2 millimeters in between stitches, then you get a very nice stitch. It's called a satin stitch. It looks very much like embroidery, and it's a great way to seal in layers of fabric when you don't sew them together. So that is what I should have done, and that would be called applique, but very heavy applique. People don't normally use felt for applique. You have to use like a heavy duty needle for that, I would reckon, especially if it's going on top of a very thick fabric. So you can see how many pins I'm using to put the nose on. It's very important at this stage just to try to line it up as close as possible. Like, I know I've talked about the notches not really being useful, but I should have included notches of my own just to line things up, because the nose came out off center and that definitely doesn't help with the overall wonkiness of Cheyenne's inner tube. And yeah, it's just a very thick piece of fabric to be sewing together. Like the fleece, it's very thick, and then the felt, it's very thick. So together they just make for a much clunkier piece when sewing, especially with the thickness that the needle has to go through to make the seams. You can counteract this by increasing the seam height, and that gives the needle a little bit more leanway and space to work, but it definitely can contribute to the wonkiness. And then I show you muzzle tie a little bit, and you can see me going in. You have to hand sew a muzzle tie, but I cut the middle way too big, and the middle, from what I think happened, was able to fray, which is why it got wonkier over time as well, because the fabric I just used muslin, which is not a strong material and likely frayed and warped with the head that was just mismeasured, and I added too much stuffing. And also, looking at the inner tube, I don't think I made space for the neck, which is probably also why the head is a little wonky. I should have made notations for cutting a space out to connect the head to the inner tube. That was definitely a blunder. Don't know where my head was at. But you can see me doing just like the smallest stitch ever in between the wings to add a little bit of like detail for the feathers, and that's why they're hardly visible. It was literally a single like straight stitch, and that's not enough to make it cool. Oh, so on the wings, clip your curves. I've already explained clip your curves earlier in this video, but if you've forgotten, that's when you go an eighth of an inch into your seam allowance, and with a pair of scissors, you just make a little clip, an eighth of an inch. So it's about halfway down your seam allowance, and this just lets the curves and like sharp corners that you sew, it lets them flip around better and without warping too much. If you don't clip them, they'll gather or they'll get stuck. And if you have like a corner, like a sharp corner to like an antenna or something, you're also going to want to clip the corner. So we're sewing the wing. Does not look great. Yeah, so since there were two wings that were symmetrical in each one, I just doubled up the pattern piece. The wings alone used the same amount of pattern pieces and fabric as Ramon's whole, like, mustache. Just like the wings. And then, like, oh, there's so many pattern pieces to Cheyenne. If I were to recommend eggs that I think are ready to sew now, or egg patterns that I think people who are watching this could feasibly do and it would look good, I would say Ramon, Palm, Dapper, Taline, and maybe Bobby, Juanaflipa, and Geg. I feel like those are the eggs I would vouch for the patterns I made. As long as you listen to my video and make the top stitching changes, then I think you would be fine. And you actually use an iron. Everything else, make at your own risk. But here I am sewing some of the darts of the inner tube. I wanted a little bit more volume, which worked too well. That's why it looks so much thicker than the wings, even though the wings of Cheyenne should be like the same thickness as the inner tube. Because I made the inner tube too big with the darts, the wings just look way too small. Oh, I probably should have added darts to the wings. I probably should have used a better pattern for the wings instead of just doubling up pieces of felt. Because, like, doubling up pieces of felt to make something 3D works, especially with Ramon's mustache. But if you want something to actually have curves and fill space, you really need to be using darts. And you need to be using, like, other angles or other pieces. Like, a dart definitely could have helped the feathers. But we learn, we grow, we take time away from a project to regain our energy on it. We are human. I also should have decreased the size of the inner ring. I think it's just too big on the egg. It could have gone down like maybe 15% decrease and still fit on the egg and be fine. But when you're working with something that big, like an inner ring, and then you account seam allowance into it, like the numbers get messed up very fast. Okay. We're sewing the inner part of the inner tube, and you can see where the wing is because it is inside the inner tube fabric. And now I'm sewing the other side of the inner tube, and eventually I will sew them together with the head. You can see the other wing. And now I'm going in and doing the inside of the inner tube. And you can see I have the pre-sewn duck head, and I'm just going in for the next seam to attach it to the inner tube. And I'm gonna pin it, right? Yep, I pinned it. So we're gonna go around and give it a neck seam, but I did not mark a place to cut for a neck seam on the inner tube, which is totally not good. That is just like some things you can get away with without marking the inner tube, like for the wings and the tail, we just simply sewed right over it. We didn't leave it any openings, but for the neck we left it open, and the neck is just so big that it warps the inner tube around it. And honestly, we probably should have left an opening for the wings and the tail. I think it would have made it a little bit more 3D and it would have helped, but now we know. Alright. And this should be about the end of the sewing, and we can look at how it all came together. Like, as much as I am picking this pattern apart, like, it is still cute. That's why I chose to use the beak in another project. Like, it's a cute duck. Was it exactly what I was going for? No. Did I make mistakes? Of course. But it's cute, and you can definitely see the vision I was going for, which is why I thought it was important to show you just the duck inner tube without the egg in it, so you can see all of the work that went into it. Alright, and now we are going to place Cheyenne's egg inside his little inner ring so he can float around and have a fun time. As you can see, his little feetsies stick out the bottom, and the ring can go around his waist and fit there, but it's not a snug fit. It's pretty loose, and the inner ring is so heavy it falls off really easily. I don't know if you've noticed during the course of this video, but I have been wearing my Filza hoodie, so Cheyenne and Tallulah are definitely two eggs that I watched a lot, and I definitely wanted to do them justice, which is kind of why they were last. I was saving some energy for a last hurrah. Well, they weren't exactly last. There's one egg left, but this egg is a little different. But that was my Cheyenne. I hope you love him as much as I do. He is a very cool egg. And I love the stories Cheyenne was able to tell, especially with Lula. Last but not least is Geg the Egg. This was Slimecicle's egg during the presidential elections arc. Since Slimecicle lost Juana Flipa, he decided to make his lore into that he was an egg himself now, especially so other players would give him stuff and materials, and he was running for president as an egg. It was very interesting. Very funny, but very interesting. So we are going to take it from the top and follow the whole process of making this egg. I'm also realizing now that I put the markings for where to put the legs onto my egg pattern wrong. It should be on the side with the short dart, not the long dart. The long dart is the top of the egg. So this is wrong. This is definitely how a lot of my eggs ended up a little bit wonky. Okay, well, now I know what happened, watching things back in hindsight. But basically, I'm starting with a very lime green felt. I'm not using the same egg material because I wanted the base to be green, because canonically Geg is green and made out of slime and goop. And then I didn't show this process because I didn't really know how I would photograph and video needle felting, but I have a dark green felt that I needle felted in little splotches that I tried my best to mimic Canon with, but I just needle felted those on, and since I used a felt base, it was really easy, and you don't really see a lot of the seam in between where they meet. And then I mentioned this when I was making Juana Flipa, but Geg's glasses are just using Juana Flipa's pattern, but I added white instead of the plastic, and then I added pupils, which I also needle felted on. We love needle felting. And here you can see in more detail me sewing the egg base. So there are 8 darts in the egg, and then there are 4 full seams connecting the egg pieces. And then each leg has 4 seams, 1 connecting the toes to the foot, 1 making the foot a cylinder, 1 making the leg a cylinder, and the ankle seam. So that's 4 on each leg for 8 total, plus the 4 seams for the body is 12, plus the 8 darts is 20 lines of stitches for the whole egg, which actually isn't too many considering other patterns have more. And for a plush, the seams are very simple, so it isn't too bad. And I'm just including the leg seams onto the seam they would be on. You can see me attaching the feet. I made all of the legs in like a really big batch, and I just picked from the batch of legs as I sewed each leg onto an egg, so I didn't really go in the process of doing that. But it is a bit tricky to sew the foot part around to the circle of the toe, so I would say be careful with that and take your time, especially if it's your first time making one of the legs. Really use a lot of pins and go very slowly with the machine, or just try hand sewing it first. You can see the Filza hoodie again that I mentioned. I'm also chewing gum, which you might see. Okay, we're going. We're pinning. Pins always help, especially when you're just unsure how something's going to go together, and with the felt, it was a lot thicker than the material I was using for the other egg bases, the white fabric, so it was important that I took my time and went at a comfortable speed. And here's the fabric blocking the camera again. And yeah, really take your time going over the leg. I went over half the leg on one part of the fabric, and this is me going over the other half of the leg. And you can see that my needle is kind of getting a little stuck in the fabric, especially at the beginning. I kind of have to walk the fabric through my machine by like lifting the foot up repeatedly. That definitely is something that can happen. I sped all the videos up just so this whole video wouldn't take multiple days to watch. But basically, I slowed down my machine speed when I walk it over the beginning when it gets stuck. So don't let the post production speed up fool you. Like, I am taking my time and being safe. And especially with a sewing machine, like, you really want to be safe. Like, yes, they're at home sewing machines, but they are very highly powered. Like, the motor is strong enough to go through your finger. So be careful. And if you're not confident, hand sewing always works. But our gag is looking nice. It's pretty fast going once you get used to the egg pattern. And here you can see me hand stitch him up, because stuffed animals you always need to hand stitch a little bit because you need to leave a little seam open to turn them right side out. And for the egg patterns you need to leave, I want to say, about 2.5 inches of seam open just to get both feet through. So there we are. We are going to hand stitch this guy up. We're going to do a ladder stitch. I also recommend doubling up your thread when you do a ladder stitch, just because it'll make for a stronger seam. Alright, so now I am cutting out all the pieces I need for Gig's glasses. Very simple, I've already done these before, and I am so ready for all the hand stitching. Yippee! But I'm just going and I'm using a black felt double-sided fleece for the whites of the eyes, and then black felt again for the pupils. And it really isn't too many pattern pieces. As I said, I really need to redo the pattern to make the glasses, actually fold like glasses and not just be straight out. But they're cute enough and they work. Alright, so we are cutting them out. We have only 6 pieces for the actual glasses frames, and then 4 pieces for the quote-unquote lenses, or in Geg's case, the eyes. I do really enjoy the detail that the 3D modelers had, making Geg's accessory the same as Juana Flipa's, because Slimesicle was one of the players in charge of Juana Flipa. I think it's a very cool detail, very symbolic. The server was full of a lot of lore and symbolism, and it's going to go very fast. Same process as Juana Flipa's, sewing the sides onto the mane for both the front and the back, and then sewing them together. And of course, I'm not going to show the hand stitching or the needle felting for the eye parts, or for the little splotch parts for the egg. But believe me, it happened. I was there. Poked my finger a few times. So notice how I am fully stopping my sewing machine if I need to put my fingers there to grab something. Safety is important, and it's okay to fully stop your machine to give yourself time and space to do what you need to do, especially when you need to turn the thing that you're sewing. Fully stop, keep your needle down and your foot up, and that's the best way to pivot. Alright, and now we are going to flip her inside out. And that is all the video I have of the process of making these eggs. That was the last one. You get a little video part of the way through showing you what the pupils are going to look like, but nothing else showing the actual process. Egg was the last egg I wanted to do out of the original group. And he came out really cool. I really like all the detail, and the glasses are very cute, as much as I dislike the pattern for them. And needle felting, I really should have top stitched. The needle felting comes off super easily. But yeah, I'm really happy with how he turned out. This whole process was a new experience for me. I learned a lot. Thank you for everybody who's watched so far. Sorry how many times I messed up during this. This whole video is kind of going to be going over the first batch of eggs. I did add on an empanada and a papito egg after the fact for my friends because they really liked the eggs. I could have added a sunny. I have the glasses pattern. I just needed to use black felt instead of the clear, but I was not going to do that because I really don't like the glasses pattern. It's very tricky and it has a lot of hand stitching, which I didn't want to do. The chunsik egg I did not make a pattern for as well. The hat looked really complicated and I did not know what I was going to do for the beads because I didn't want to rely on actual pony beads. I think I could go back and make one now if there was enough interest in it, but I don't know. The cucurucho face mask egg did not make a pattern for that one. If there's interest, I'll of course do it. I had also started the process of patterning out a cucurucho, but I never managed to finish it because, again, senior year gets really busy. I do want to say that this video has been something I've wanted to make since I did this project. I really wasn't good at editing and I had a lot of class stuff going on in college, so I was not able to get it out, and I just did not have faith in my ability to make this into a coherent video. It has always been my intention to share this process with the fandom because I think fandom lives off creation. Inspiration inspires. Everybody's creativity builds off one another, and I want to see what people do with this. Since I have made these patterns, they have been released, albeit on my Tumblr, so not a ton of people seeing it. And I did promise some friends that I would help them make their own eggs, and I never did that because life got busy. But I do want to see what people do with this, and I do want to see the camaraderie and the building off of each other's ideas continue into the future, especially now that QSMP 2 is out. I think it'd be really interesting. So that being said, I did record a lot of my process in 2023, so a lot of the footage is the wrong aspect ratio. It's not the best camera. It's a little old. It's a little clunky. I didn't know about shots. I still don't. I'm still very new to this. But just be kind, please. It was a very fun project, and I don't regret it. I think the server was really important, and it really brought together a lot of different communities, and it's a shame how it ended the way it did, especially the admins who haven't gotten closure for it yet. But I still think it's important to show this part of my sewing journey because, one, I grew a lot doing it, and two, it's a very important project. And I'm kind of glad it's back in some capacity because I do think the world needs something to bring together different cultures, but I just wish that the admins got an apology. That's what I'm gonna say. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. All of the egg patterns, I'll set something up so you can access them. It might be a Ko-Fi, but thank you.